Samantha Power is a journalist turned diplomat. She was a foreign correspondent for many years, the author of the book A Problem from Hell, which won the Pulitzer Prize. She was an advisor to Barack Obama in the Senate and the White House. During his presidency, she was the permanent representative to the UN. During President Biden's administration, she was the administrator of USAID. I should say she was the last Senate-confirmed appointee to that position. Now she's back at Harvard University, where she has appointments in both the Kennedy School of Government and Harvard Law School. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, David.
We're a year away from the dissolution, the end of USAID. You've called it the ravaging of USAID. And I'd like to start just by asking you to help us take stock of this moment and explain what's been lost over the course of the last year.
Well, the predictions are that 14 million lives will be lost by 2030, and we're already seeing expansions in hunger and severe malnutrition, a large number of deaths, kids who just a year and a half ago would be able to have reliable access to a mosquito bed net, now at risk of dying of a mosquito bite. No kid in 2026 on this earth should die from a mosquito bite when it is so preventable. So the death toll is growing. We see with Ebola our rapid response capacity eviscerated. There are still individuals who call themselves people who work on Ebola, but they are too few, they are too dispersed, and many of them lack the expertise that was exported when the USAID staff was terminated so abruptly. The unseen costs are equally dramatic, and that ranges from girls who are no longer getting an education because USAID was either helping support a school to do that or leveraging its other programming in health or clean energy or agriculture to push a government to move in that direction. Villages that won't be electrified. USAID, through its Power Africa program, helped connect about 150 million people to electricity. Most of that was in places that would never have been able to connect to the grid in my lifetime. Pop-up solar panels, private-public partnerships that allowed things to happen at a much more accelerated pace. So the soft power suicide for the United States, I think, is pretty obvious when you pull the rug out from programming of this nature with no warning, with no regard for the human consequences of those actions. That's going to cause, to say the least, a severe trust deficit. But I think when you go behind that as just an argument and think about the families that on a Friday were able to send their female child to school, and on a Monday suddenly found that that child was no longer welcome. The family member who goes to get antiretrovirals to treat HIV, which has now become a disease that you can live with, thanks to George W. Bush and the PEPFAR program combating HIV around the world, able to get their meds on a Friday, showing up on a Monday, the med's still available, but the pharmacy closed because the health workers laid off because of the cuts that the Trump administration made. So it's all system failure, an all system attack, and there's not one part of human development that has been untouched by this blunder.
I hear you mentioning children several times. I was going to ask you who this has affected and is likely to affect going forward. It sounds like children are going to pay a huge cost for this.
Yeah, the 14 million prediction from the Lancet in a peer-reviewed study that are anticipated to die preventable deaths by 2030, 4.5 million of those are likely to be children under 5. And maybe one way to really bring this home is that over the last decades, every year, we have seen child mortality drop every single year. And 2025, the year that USAID was dismantled, is the first year in decades where we have seen deaths of children under 5 increase. And the destruction of USAID is a huge part of that story.
What has this last year been like for you? I imagine you've had a lot of conversations with now former colleagues at USAID. What have those folks said to you, and what have their lives been like in light of this happening?
Well, thank you for asking about them. It is 15,000 people who were directly employed in some fashion by USAID all around the world. About 2/3 of the places they worked were crisis zones, so places that had suffered coups or conflicts or natural disasters. And they didn't care. They worked in those places because they saw that America's fate was connected to the fates of those communities in which they worked. They put their lives on the line, and they were spit upon by their own government. They were literally, in many cases, physically escorted out of the USAID headquarters if they were in Washington by security guards. That can't happen. If that were men and women wearing our country's uniform, military uniform, there would have been a complete uproar. The fact that they were wearing USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, with the agency mantra from the American people, somehow that meant that that uproar didn't occur. And they were denigrated and lied about, described as radical left lunatics, when what they've been doing is the nation's bidding with bipartisan support for decades.
You've had a year plus to think about this and try to process it. And I'm curious, were there signs after the election during that transition that this was something that the administration was weighing or intended to do, or did it catch you completely by surprise?
There were not signs of any intention among any prominent Republicans to dismantle USAID. People are very familiar now with Project 2025, which was the broader plan for downsizing the federal government and revamping programming across the board. That called for the reform of USAID, and reforms like ending diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, reforms like moving more programming toward fossil fuel supplies of energy and away from clean energy sources. You know, kind of parts of the Republican Party expressive platform showing up in adjustments to what USAID was doing in the world. People also have a hard time remembering this, but in October of 2024, so just a month before the election, USAID received one of the largest appropriations in its history, and that came with Mike Johnson at the helm of a Republican-controlled Congress. So the bipartisan support was thick. USAID was extremely earmarked, which meant that Republicans and Democrats alike had their favorite programs. They had seen those programs out in the world. They saw the connection between building lab surveillance in Democratic Republic of Congo and preventing Ebola from coming to this country. If they came from red states, members of Congress, they saw that USAID was buying $2 billion worth of American surplus farm commodities, agricultural commodities, and then providing those commodities to hungry people. They saw that farmers, many of them, felt really connected with that public service, with famine alleviation around the world. So this was Elon Musk and Doge and a handful of tech bros in a kind of fever dream, building on the shock and awe of those early days of the Trump administration more generally, but basically putting a knife through butter and then realizing that they could just go and go and go without Republicans or the president stopping them. And then, of course, President Trump threw his weight behind the dismantlement as an expression of America first. But please don't read backwards from the fact that it was unlawfully dismantled to the idea that there was a thick constituency behind that. And maybe my last just proof point to that is that President Trump himself just signed a $50 billion foreign assistance bill into law, which, if USAID was still institutionally alive, USAID would have seen a substantial cut to its budget. But we're talking, 15, 20%. Many of the programs that were the lifeblood of what we did, what USAID did, and those programs that were denigrated are the very programs that this Congress, now that both the Senate and the House controlled by Republicans, have written into law and asked the Trump administration to carry out. So the constituency not only existed, even if it was far too quiet and cowardly when USAID was being dismantled, but it exists even as we sit here today.
I asked about your degree of surprise at this happening. How much surprise do you have that Republicans, who I assume you knew before through your work, 2 White Houses and here as an academician, have behaved in this way? Has it surprised you? Have you talked to any of them about their decision to back this?
Well, initially in the early days, I had very productive, I thought, back channel text message exchanges and phone calls with Republicans who were the biggest champions of USAID's work, and where they would reach out to me and say, okay, they're saying this, there's this claim that USAID spend this amount on this crazy program, provide me with the facts. And we had these crack teams that had come together and were turning around the facts as best we could. I should remind people that one of the first things that DOJ did as an accompaniment to trying to destroy USAID was to take down the website. So that actually abetted their campaign.
The USAID website was taken down.
The USAID website was taken down, making it hard for journalists, members of Congress, and others who wanted to present facts in the face of these lies to summon those facts. And we were so nerdy and faithful to facts that, we weren't going to do what they were doing, which is they were just making stuff up, and we weren't going to make stuff up in response. So people were, reaching out, by text message all around the world to try to, get information that could be used and that was fact-checked. Though I will say within a couple weeks, when it began to seem like more of a fait accompli, my text messages began to go unreturned. And that was crushing. I mean, these are individuals who have seen these programs. And if anything, the most vocal Republican champions, including those on the Appropriations Committee, in some of my last hearings, so in 2024, months before the dismantlement would occur, they were publicly arguing that USAID's budget should be greater, more substantial, not smaller.
I want to ask you more broadly about soft power, which this country has practiced for a very long time. That's doing good work in the furtherance of people looking at us favorably and being allies of ours. Is this a country today that still practices soft power? How much of that has been kind of neutered by what's happened over the last year and a half?
Well, as the former administrator of USAID, of course, I'm focused on what I described earlier as the soft power suicide associated with terminating life-saving programs and life betterment programs overnight. I mean, even if this administration had wanted to absorb USAID in the State Department or significantly reduce or even end foreign assistance, there's a way to do it on a glide path in a way that takes account the human consequences. They did it in the way most designed to obliterate soft power, human capital, human trust. And I should say parenthetically, they did it in a manner that they've just announced is going to cost them $19 billion. Wasted American taxpayer just because of cancellation fees, terminations, severances, basically talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. $19 billion in taxpayer money that could have been used to save lives being used because of the abrupt termination. But your question isn't really just about assistance, it's about soft power. And I think it is important to put even these dramatic cuts and these huge blows to America's standing in the broader context of threatening to invade Greenland, killing fishermen without much evidence being brought forward about who those fishermen are, being seen to act with complete impunity, being seen to use the powers of the White House. We know how many foreign tourists come and press their faces up to the fence to see the White House. This is an incredibly esteemed institution, whatever the flaws in our foreign policy over the years. But to see the White House used as a vehicle for self-dealing and family profiteering. So the denigration of our reputation and our standing, which you could argue the first blow to that, or the first chapter in the book that was being written on soft power suicide, maybe came with USAID's dismantlement, but every day of every week a new chapter in that book is being written.
I'd like to talk about the Ebola crisis that's unfolding. You mentioned a moment ago. 1,000 cases or more reported so far, more than 250 deaths in the DRC. What do you make of this happening? And I guess, germane to our conversation, were USAID still an operating concern, how would this be playing out differently?
I don't believe we would have a spiraling Ebola epidemic if USAID had not been dismantled. The USAID emergency response teams had gone just over the last couple years from responding to outbreaks like this, and I will say, of course, this is a distinct outbreak. Not every outbreak is the same, and this is an extremely challenging one, but gone from responding in a manner that would take about 2 weeks to responding in less than 48 hours. And that is the reason that the flare-ups, whether of Ebola or of monkeypox or whatever the latest pathogen is, the smothering of those outbreaks in even the most hard-to-reach parts of places like Democratic Republic of Congo, that response time had become just a matter of hours or days because that infrastructure was in place. We had permanent standing USAID missions in Democratic Republic of Congo and in Uganda. Both those missions dismantled. Our Congolese and our Ugandan staff laid off without so much of a care. We had made substantial investments in lab capacity, but sometimes in the case of an outbreak, your ability to secure transportation to that lab to bring your samples or the tests that you have taken to get the results, transportation can be an impediment. So you need to be able to move logistically and in terms of procurement and infrastructure as a disaster response specialist agency can move. The U.S. government doesn't have that anymore. It's sort of the international equivalent of FEMA is gone. This also can't be separated from the decision to leave the World Health Organization and to gut the World Health Organization's emergency response funding as well. So we think about USAID and everything we would have done. We would also have been partnering with World Health Organization and, of course, with the Center for Disease Control, which has also seen substantial cuts in its international infrastructure. So, we'll never get to go back in time and test this assertion that I'm making, but all we can do is point to the track record of USAID, the CDC, and World Health Organization working in tandem since the huge outbreak of 2014, where we all learned very valuable lessons. And there's a reason that this first month of this outbreak is the deadliest of any first month of a previous Ebola outbreak, including 2014.
I spoke with Jeremy Conondike, who headed up the response to that 2014 outbreak, and a point he made is there may not be an acute risk to Americans yet from this outbreak, but it's an important test case to see how we, in this new configuration, are able to respond or not respond to something like this. Do you agree with that? What can we learn from what's happening in DRC today that could affect us more acutely here in the States?
Well, you would think that we would need to learn the lesson again and again, since we just had a global pandemic that killed millions of people and shut down economies and caused such hardship for Americans and for people all around the world. You would think that our memories and our internalization of those lessons would stay with us, such that the global health security infrastructure would not have been broken down. Even if the Trump administration decided to do what it did, that there would have been a carve-out for things that have such a direct benefit for Americans. I think that what you see is a State Department and a Secretary of State and a president even, or at least some on the National Security Council, who have been caught massively flat-footed, who are on defense, trying to summon resources every day. There's like a new announcement of we're sending this amount of millions of dollars in this or that, but they don't have the expertise still on hand. They're trying to rehire some of the people who were laid off. To their eternal credit, those individuals care much more about serving their country than they do even the pain and the humiliation that they were subjected to. So if they have the chance to serve, many of them are saluting and trying to be of use to our country and to people who are suffering in Africa from this outbreak. But throwing money and resources at the problem while also having to rebuild the plane that you have dismantled is a big mistake. And what this administration doesn't do is ever admit mistakes, ever take accountability, and what a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate really has failed to do is bring administration officials forward to answer for this. This should not be happening. And I will say those numbers, while grave and worrying in their own right, as I said, the deadliest first month of any Ebola outbreak in recent memory, my suspicion is, and I'm sure Jeremy Condick's suspicion is, that those numbers are undercounts. Why? Because we don't even have the teams in place to do the measurement, to do the tabulations, because WHO, with its shrunken budget, was slower than it would have otherwise been to deploy. So let's learn the lesson. Let's not be afraid to say dismantling the global health security architecture was a mistake. Let's not continue to assert that everything's going swimmingly. And let's recognize that while it may be the case that Ebola is deadly and devastating for those it affects, but stays confined there and doesn't come here, that is going to be something that we cannot reliably count on for future pathogens and infectious diseases.
I want to ask you about Iran. When you were the U.S. representative to the UN, you worked in the JCPOA, brought that, of course, to the Security Council and worked with allies on that agreement. As you look at what's happening now, the talks underway between the U.S. and Iran with these two other parties, are you optimistic, first, that there will be some sort of deal that comes out of that? And then do you have optimism that, should there be one, it would be one that would either match or rival the one that was in place before?
I suppose I am optimistic that the Trump administration wants to end this war, for the reason that the war has gone so badly for them. That's not an ideal negotiating posture. The Obama administration's negotiating posture was having mobilized the most severe sanctions against an expanding nuclear program that the world had ever seen, unity not only with our European allies, but also with Russia and China, who threw their weight behind those sanctions. That unity was a major part of and the severity of those sanctions was a major part of the story for why Iran came to the table and accepted the most intrusive inspection regime that had ever been negotiated, and the shutting down of nuclear sites, and the vow to not develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, so many of the concessions that they made were the product of that pressure. The posture that the Trump administration is bringing to the negotiation, especially with an eye, I gather, on the November midterm elections, is gas prices are too high. The Strait of Hormuz needs to be reopened. This hasn't brought about any of our stated objectives yet, including permanently disabling or dismantling their ballistic missile program, or curbing and permanently dismantling their support for regional proxies. And certainly it hasn't brought about regime change, in that the regime is arguably even more hardline and radical, and certainly more militarized, with the role of the IRGC, even more central to every decision. So I think, given how it's going, I'm not optimistic that the deal is going to match that of the JCPOA. I suspect it'll be a far worse deal, but even if it were to match, I'm sure the Trump administration will say it doesn't and that it's a better deal. But even if it were to match, even in that happy scenario, and nobody would be happier, I think, than former Obama administration officials to see something like the reconstitution of the JCPOA, the harms done by this war to end up back where the Trump administration in its first term started, to end up, let's say, in that optimistic scenario that they end up back with the JCPOA. What about the Iranian lives lost? What about the Lebanese lives lost? What about the 13 U.S. service member lives lost? What about the toll on the American people of paying, on average, 55 cents more per gallon of gas, which, next to lives lost, of course, is not the most important element, but the amount of needless suffering that this war of choice has brought about is hard to find words for.
Israel was not a party to that memo of understanding that was signed by the president and the Iranians, but it continues to have influence over sort of the course of events here. And there is a chorus, as you know, a growing chorus of people saying the U.S. should reevaluate the way that it manages that relationship with Israel. I wonder if you're among that group, that in light of what we saw after October 7th, in light of what's happened with this war, if this is a moment when that needs to happen.
The Israeli government is fighting wars with nowhere near the regard for civilian lives that our military, at least in every administration I've ever worked for, has demanded. And so that was true in Gaza when I was at USAID, and we were pleading with the Israeli government to allow more humanitarian assistance to flow into Gaza. Very complicated situation in Gaza with gangs and Hamas, and I don't want to in any way downplay the complexity, but you can only control what you can control, and the Israeli government was able to inspect and monitor what went into Gaza and was able throughout the conflict to allow far more food and medicine in than it chose to do so. That's just one example. The number of attacks on hospitals, on journalists, the sort of appearance, at least by some individuals within the Israeli government, of lumping all Palestinians in Gaza together, a sort of collective punishment mindset by some, and they're very explicit about it in their statements. That absolutely demands a reevaluation, because it is U.S. weapons in the main that are being used to fight in a manner that departs from the manner that we, in all of our statements vis-a-vis virtually any other country, we demand countries fight.
You did a series of interviews at the end of your tenure. You were still in government, and in a handful of them, you were asked about Gaza and the difficulty of getting humanitarian aid to people on the Strip. In a number of them, you were read passages from your book, A Problem from Hell. And at the time, you said you don't form foreign policy on your own. You're a member of the government, and I think one of your mentors, Michael Ignatieff, said you were reckoning with what he called the dilemmas of power. Now that you're out of government, now that some time has passed, do you think differently about that period of time? Is there more that you could have done under those circumstances?
I mean, it's tough because I'm here, in an academic setting, and I feel the freedom, of course, to speak and write and all of that you don't have when you're in government. But I'm not helping any Palestinians here in the way that I had the chance to do, even if they understandably were immensely frustrated, not only with the United States, but with USAID and the limits of what we were able to achieve. But, being able to sit down with Bibi Netanyahu and say, this is not okay, and to be able to provide President Biden with the facts of what was and wasn't happening and the civilian casualties that were occurring. I mean, again, you don't get an A for effort, but USAID was the arm of the U.S. government that was pushing the hardest for the welfare of Palestinian civilians to be central to U.S. foreign policy. So we were pushing the Situation Room, but we were also pushing in our interface with the Israeli government. Because of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the strength and history of the partnership, it was a USAID official who was the equivalent of the red phone when a Palestinian NGO or an international NGO was getting shot at. It was a USAID official who would get the call and say, can you call the Israelis and tell them to stop shooting? And we say to the Israelis, can we just have a red phone between you and the organization? Oh, it's the UN, they're biased, so USAID's role was important, and yet the limits of what we were able to achieve are evident. What could I have done differently? I mean, I wish I had been more persuasive. I wish that when we put in place a process to assess whether the Israeli government was meeting the assurances they had offered about unimpeded humanitarian access, and when USAID came forward and said they're not, I wish that my colleagues had embraced that finding, because USAID was on the ground or our partners were on the ground at the very least in Gaza, and those facts should have been integrated at the highest levels and should have informed the decisions about whether to continue the flow of military assistance. I was not sufficiently persuasive. I wish I'd been more persuasive. And yeah, I definitely spend a lot of time thinking, was there some way, to have somehow taken what we saw was happening on the ground and had it land in a manner that shook us out of the traditional way of doing business? Because Israel wasn't, because of October 7th and the trauma and the horror of what had been done to Israelis, and for other reasons, owing to the nature of who constituted the government. People not in favor of a two-state solution, some individuals who'd never really cared about the welfare of Palestinians at all. But owing to those two circumstances, Israel was not operating and continues not to operate in a business-as-usual manner. And yet there are aspects of the national security establishment that kept operating as if we were in a pre-October 7th kind of relationship. And I think now there's a lot of evidence that that's going to change, including even the Trump administration. Of course, the weapons flow is still happening, but the reluctance of U.S. in both parties to see U.S. interests so driven by Israel's own actions and perspectives, and I think in both parties a desire to see U.S. interests paramount. And in the case of certainly the Democratic Party, U.S. values paramount, including international humanitarian law.
So you never thought of resigning?
No, because I knew I'd be here tweeting. I mean, the goal was to get as much assistance to Palestinians and to, if President Biden was going to continue to provide military assistance, at least to leverage that assistance so the Israeli military was being held to account for the attacks on civilians, hospitals, journalists, agriculture, the whole list of civilian infrastructure that was decimated. I just didn't have a sense that out of government that would be impactful, and I did, and I think I said this in some of my last interviews. While this is the most important issue, especially foreign policy issue for many young people, it was definitely one of the most important issues I've ever worked on in my career, one of the most frustrating, heartbreaking, for sure. I was also in a job where we were supporting Ukraine and we were averting famine in Somalia, and so there was a lot of good that could be done. And I think we have also seen that when the Trump administration came in and there was no USAID, as bad as the situation was for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank before, the Israelis, starting on January 20th, 2025, had complete impunity to do what they wanted. And that what had been an insufficient flow of assistance became a trickle with almost no scrutiny from the Trump administration prior to the ceasefire.
I want to close by kind of looking ahead at democratic foreign policy, at aid in light of what's happened. And Brian Schatz, the senator, had a tweet that caught fire a few weeks back. He said, it's fair to want a whole new crop of foreign policy staffers in the next Democratic administration. Do you think that he has a point? Is it time for kind of a whole-scale reinvention of what democratic foreign policy is? And I ask you this mindful of the fact that a couple of decades ago you wrote an essay in which you encouraged Democrats to think more about the way they approach foreign policy that effectively that kind of ceded a lot of that ground to Republicans who promoted this muscular foreign policy in the wake of Vietnam. Is this another moment when Democrats have to do a reinvention like that?
I think so. But I would say that every time you're out in the wilderness, it's your responsibility to look at the world as it is and the world that it's going to be, because that's the one thing you don't have when you're in government is bandwidth and time for the kind of reflection of that nature. And I also think an infusion of talent and expertise that is unencumbered by some of the habits that grow up over the years, I think those fresh eyes are invaluable. So I'm pretty sympathetic to that idea. I think you want to marry it with a recognition that when you've gutted the federal government, when you've dismantled USAID, cut the State Department workforce by a very large percent, you're going to need expertise as well. The hollowing out of our foreign policy institutions means that those language, subject matter, regional experts that political appointees like me turn to for their wisdom and their counsel, even as we brought what we hoped at that time, maybe we weren't sufficiently fresh eyes, but we thought we were bringing in some new ideas from having been out and looked at the world and American foreign policy critically from the outside. But that marriage of fresh, hopefully younger, people, coming in, and then the wisdom of the ages as it's inherited, you're going to need both. So the other thing I'd say is, and I think it's behind Senator Schatz's and others' comments as well, is how are we linking, whether in diplomacy or in our military deployments overseas, or in our development humanitarian work, how are we linking it to the welfare of the American people in a more compelling way? So given that that climate extreme weather events are going to increase, that technological displacement, job displacement is going to happen, given that warfare is going to be transformed as well by these new technologies, given that the world does have some scary and very disruptive features in the decades ahead, how do you convince the American people that these investments in the toolkit are worthwhile? Because what they're going to be seeing is a lot of, there's going to be some scary stuff coming down. So how do you summon positive leadership around a belief that America can do good in the world and that these investments can help stabilize what right now for people is feeling a little bit rocky?
Samantha Power, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.